Central began as a result of a church split. In October of 1912, the pastor of First Baptist Port Arthur, along with 14 other members of the congregation, pulled out, went 2 blocks over to Proctor Street, and established Central Baptist Church. This small congregation very quickly was feuding, and in early 2014, the pastor, who was at the center of much of the controversy, resigned. Over the next few months, the composition of the congregation changed a bit, and in February of 1915, Bates returned for another time. He remained until 1919 and resigned again as a result of yet another controversy. This time, however, he was gone for good, moved down to Corpus, and he left behind a struggling congregation of about 63 members. The man who took that struggling 63 and made it into a major religious institution in Port Arthur was its 4th pastor, T.E. Kennedy, Travis Edwin Kennedy. He was called in 1923. He served until health forced him to retire in 1945. He was Central's longest serving pastor. In 1924, shortly after his arrival, Central relocated from 6th Street and St. Augustine a short distance away over to 9th Avenue and DeQueen, and it'll remain there for the next half century. It'll not move again until 1976, when the congregation bought property out on 73 and moved to the northern edge of Port Arthur. Meanwhile, Kennedy was in his mid-50s, or was 51 at the time. He had considerable experience. Most recently, he had pastored Magnolia Avenue over in Beaumont. He had been a associational missionary, and so he had traveled around. He knew the region, and he brought with him to Central a broad, expansive vision. He wanted Central to become a major institution, and by 1945, he had pretty well accomplished his objective. What Kennedy wanted specifically was for the members of that congregation to participate in everything that the Southern Baptist Convention, the Baptist General Convention of Texas, and the Southeast Texas Baptist Association had to offer. He immediately encouraged members of the congregation to take those study courses. They did by the hundreds, and before long, Central was recognized at the associational level for the number of study courses completed by its members. 1925, Central Baptist was the first church in this area, the only church in this area, to conduct a vacation Bible school. It was one of only 3 churches in 1925 to conduct a vacation Bible school statewide. From that point forward, Central Baptist Church is going to be a leader in the Southern Baptist Convention of the Vacation Bible School movement. Kennedy loved those affairs. There are some photographs over there. We've lost a good many because of the flood, but there are photographs over there. He loved to put a big sign on his car, it's kind of a station wagon, announcing that the school was coming, fill it up with kids, drive through the neighborhood, horn blaring, kids yelling, announcing that the Vacation Bible School is about to begin. And they responded by the hundreds. Keep in mind that Vacation Bible School in those days lasted 2 weeks, and so they were rather extended affairs, and the response was quite impressive. The WMU. Central Baptist had one of the stronger WMUs in the area. Kennedy's wife, who was quite accomplished in her own right, was a leader of the WMU locally and statewide, and those women did everything for the church. They raised money, they supported all of the causes, and Kennedy appreciated what they did for the church. Well, he should, since his wife was one of the primary leaders, if you will. Kennedy also supported the BYPU, Baptist Young People's Union, better known to you folks as Training Union. And in the early 1940s, and the youth-led revival movement got underway, Central Baptist once again was a leader in the youth-led revival movement. By 1945, Kennedy had brought the congregation from a struggling 175 to approximately 700, with an average Sunday school enrollment of about 250. By any measuring stick, it was a successful ministry, but there was a problem. One that Kennedy never really completely got over. In 1928, 1929, late 28, early 29, there was a major split in Central's congregation. In December of 1928, 74 people walked out. A few weeks later, an additional 30-something people walked out. Consequently, altogether, a little over 100 people pulled out of Central in 1928-29 and established Fourth Avenue Baptist Church. Why did they do it? No one really knows for sure. And that's good if you're a historian, because then I can say anything I want to, and no one can really dispute it.
Nobody's around to say
It appears that some members of the congregation, however, thought that Kennedy was too old. He was only in his mid-50s, but they thought he was a bit dull in the pulpit. What was needed at Central was a young, vigorous, energetic man. And that was obviously a factor in the split, but there was more to it than that. The one area of church life that Kennedy was never really very supportive of was music. To Kennedy, the be-all and end-all of any worship service was the sermon. Music was incidental. It was secondary. As a matter of fact, Kennedy was quite blunt in his views. He stated more than once that too many services had been ruined by irresponsible choirs and choir leaders who chose the wrong songs, John, Harold, the wrong songs that in some way were inappropriate, he thought, to the message, to the invitation. It is true that as a pulpiteer, Kennedy did leave a bit to be desired, perhaps, but that was by design. Kennedy did not believe that the sermon was a place for entertainment, that it wasn't the responsibility of a preacher to entertain. The responsibility was to enlighten, to inspire, perhaps. And Kennedy, again, quite bluntly, held those preachers who tried to entertain in pretty low regard. He remarked that preachers who go around, and these were his words, telling little dog stories and flowery bouquets, are doing nothing more than reducing their congregations to admiration societies. Central was never an admiration society under Kennedy, I can assure you. However, while the man was quite straight-laced, perhaps, all business in the pulpit, he had a sense of humor, good wit. It was Kennedy, for instance, to give you an example, who diagnosed an affliction that occasionally befalls all of us. He called it morbus sabbaticus. And morbus sabbaticus is that illness that comes on rather quickly and suddenly, early Sunday morning, rendering the victim incapable of attending church and Sunday school. But miraculously, it's over by noon most of the time, or by 1 o'clock at the latest, so that you can do whatever you want to do. Morbus sabbaticus, if you will. I confess, my wife might support this, that I have fallen victim on occasion. as I suspect most of you have too. By 1945, Central Baptist Church was quite easily one of the stronger congregations in Port Arthur, in the area. The years following Kennedy, from the 1950s, the 60s, the 70s, and into the 80s, could be described, I suppose, as the glory years. These were years, for the most part, during which Central was strong financially and growing numerically. Central will never become a mega church, but at its height, it measured a very healthy 1,840. Though the numbers will fluctuate, it generally ran between 700 and 800 in Sunday school, 300 to 400 in training union, and for a brief moment in the 1950s, Central Baptist was running 350 people on Wednesday night prayer meetings. It was strong. The man who succeeded Kennedy as minister was in so many ways different from Kennedy. This was James Olin, Mormon, who will pastor from 1945 to 1954. He was a returning veteran of World War II. He was young, mid-30s. He was energetic, vigorous. He was dynamic in the pulpit. He was, in fact, a kind of hellfire brimstone preacher. He was loud, and he considered the worship service to be a time of reverence. This is a time for prayerful meditation. As a result, he did not tolerate disturbances during the sermon. He did not hesitate to call down from the pulpit youngsters who misbehaved in one way or another. It will not surprise those of you who knew him that Milton Hall had to be called down. It probably will surprise you, however, to learn that, and this is a shocker, Gail Level had to be called down one Sunday morning for passing notes to the preacher's son. Unbelievable, isn't it? Somewhat later, when Gail and I were planning to be married, Mormon had already left Central, but the Level Mormon families were very close, and so Gail wanted Mormon to perform the ceremony. So she took me out to meet him. He was an important agent. And he was gracious. He was always gracious. But the first thing he said to me practically was, I was really hoping Gail would marry my son, James Olin. So you can only wonder what was going on in those notes at an earlier date. Well, Central Baptist had the reputation, since the days of Kennedy, as a refinery church. Most of the lawyers and doctors were over at First Baptist. Central had some professionals, always had teachers. It had some small business people. But most of its members, in one way or another, were connected to the refineries, to Gulf, Texaco. Now what that meant was that Central always had a lot of skilled workers, electricians, plumbers, carpenters, brick masons, painters. And what that also meant was that when those building projects got underway, the people of Central were able to do much of the work, thereby saving the congregation a considerable amount of money. And so it was in 1951, 1952, when Central Baptist built down on Queen and 9th Avenue that large, impressive sanctuary. Not only was the building impressive, attractive. It was air conditioned. For those of you who are young, that probably doesn't mean very much. But this is 1952. Most homes in Port Arthur, Beaumont, were not yet air conditioned. Most businesses down on Proctor Street were not air conditioned. Theaters sometimes closed during the summer for a few weeks because it was simply too hot to attend those movies. Hospitals were not yet air conditioned. Central Baptist Church was a cool, inviting place for worship. It brought them in, if nothing else did, if you will. Mormon had been only slightly more progressive, perhaps, with regard to music than Kennedy. Consequently, Central Baptist will not have a genuine professional music director until 1958 under the pastorate of Bob Covington. 1958, Central called James Ennis, who had a degree in music from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. He had the training, and he knew what a music program was all about. And immediately, Central had choirs at all levels, graded choirs involving everybody. And before long, Central Baptist will be recognized again at the associational level for its music programs. To some extent, I suppose you could say, the music at Central reached its apex a few years later when the church, for the first and only time, called a team, a preacher and a song leader together. This was 1971, and it was Dale Kirkup and Jerry Jones. Those two men were young, they were enthusiastic, and they quite literally took Central by storm. They swept into Southeast Texas like a West Texas tornado. Dressed in bell-bottom polyester trousers, sporting Elvis sideburns, and having hair down over the ears. At least Jerry had hair down over the ears. One old-timer who was at Central at the time, seeing him for the first time, remarked, "Things are going to be different around here." And boy, was he right. Right off the bat, the first thing they did was to enter into an agreement with KJAC TV to televise live the morning worship service from 11 to 12. This was a big deal. KJAC was NBC. And again, keep in mind, there were only 3 major networks then, and this is one of the major ones. Consequently, all of a sudden, the Sunday morning services were carried live all across Southeast Texas into Western Louisiana. Of the two men, Jones perhaps was the more charismatic, the more dynamic, and he immediately established a number of choral groups. Young people, boys and girls. He created what he called Children of Light. An all-girls group ensemble he called Milk and Honey. An older group, young adults, he called Homeward Bound. Not only did he create these groups, but he had them out and about performing. They were busy. And again, Central Baptist will be recognized for its music program. Jerry Jones also, for the first time in Southeast Texas, had a living Christmas tree musical. Now what that meant was taking a choir loft that was designed for 40 people and transforming it into a Christmas tree-shaped choir loft to accommodate 80 people. The men of the church proved equal to the task, and when that choir loft was finished, stretching from the floor to the ceiling, 7 branches, so to speak, filled with men and women dressed in Christmassy colored attire, it was quite impressive. The living Christmas tree will be formed 3 times during the early 70s, and each time it will draw a full house, if you will. At this particular moment, Central also faced a major decision. Central Baptist had always been a neighborhood church. Most of its members lived within either walking distance or just a short drive to worship. By the 1960s and 70s, that was changing. More and more of its members now lived out at Port Neches, Nederland, Groves, the northern edge of the city. And so consequently, Central had to decide, was it going to remain where it had always been and minister to an increasingly diverse population, become a different kind of church? Or was it going to follow its membership to the suburbs? Tom and Ann Wu, who were highly regarded members of that congregation, urged it to stay where it was. Minister to the people in your midst. August 1973, Central purchased 17 acres of prime real estate out on Highway 73 with plans of moving out and duplicating there the success that it had known down on DeQueen. 1 month after that decision was made, Dale Kirkup suddenly resigned. Stunner. Jerry Jones will stay on for a few more years. But the man who led the church as it built new facilities out on Highway 73 was young Tucker. Tucker was a flamboyant sort. He was demonstrative. He was showy. During this period, 1975, 76, when the church was being constructed under Tucker's direction, leadership, it was, quite frankly, worth going down to the building site and spending a day just to enjoy the meal prepared by the women. But let me emphasize, the women did vastly more than prepare meals. They painted every door in that place. They designed or decorated the women's restroom, which was more than a restroom. It was a dressing facility to accommodate women on special occasions, weddings, and so on. And they kept the work area clean. So that in November 1976, Central moved to its site over on Highway 73. 1 month later, young Tucker resigned. Jerry Jones stayed on a while longer, but he too resigned in March of 1977. Within 2 weeks of Jerry's resignation, the deacons recommended unanimously, and the congregation voted approvingly, to end the television ministry. In retrospect, a decision of questionable judgment. Nevertheless, it was in 77 that the congregation brought Randolph Stinson to the pastorate. Stinson was quite capable, and somewhat like Kennedy, he too had a vision of what Central could be. And specifically, he wanted to involve Central in the community in ways that it had never been before. And for Stinson, that meant a daycare center in which children, toddlers up to about age 12, could be cared for in a Christian environment. It meant a Christian school 1 month after Stinson arrived, the daycare was established. 1979, the school was established. And those two ministries were the heart and core for Randolph Stinson. And they got off to a good start. Things were going well, doing good. But the problem was that Stinson was at Central at a time of economic hardship. Quite suddenly, the mid-1980s, Texas was hit by a severe economic downturn affecting the petroleum industry. That industry scaled back on drilling. All drilling equipment companies ceased their activity. Men lost their jobs. Many of them had to relocate. And contributions to churches all across the state, all denominations, not just Baptist, ebbed sharply. And as that occurred, Baptist at Central scrutinized more closely the budget. Where can we save money? How can we meet our expenses? The cooperative program was frequently a target. Travel by the staff, a target. Literature, a target. And of course, the daycare and the school came under closer scrutiny. The debate over the school and the daycare became contentious at times. Stinson urged that they be kept. They were so important, he felt, that they should not be weighed solely in monetary terms. They were too vital. They involved Central in ways that it had never been before. 1992, a weary Stinson resigned. The school, which had always been the weaker of the two, was ended in 1995 during the ministry of Stephen Dill. The daycare lasted for another decade or so, but it was ended in 2008 under Pastor Sigmund. And with the ending of the daycare, the Stinson legacy ended. Now, to put this in perspective, and to understand why Centralites made those decisions, by 2008, the total membership of Central was generally listed as 1,000 or 1,200, somewhere in that range. But that's a misleading figure. About 500 or so were non-residents, people who had disappeared. No one knew where they were. They didn't participate in the life of the church. And so the actual membership was closer to 500 and 600. Sunday school enrollment was about 150. Average attendance in the 90s. Training union, the choir loft was sufficient to accommodate it. With diminishing numbers went diminishing income, and everything was scrutinized in those days. Phil presided over a congregation quite ably during times of economic stress. One of the criticisms that had been leveled at Kennedy was that he was more of a preacher, more of a teacher than a preacher. That's a distinction that I've really never found particularly useful. I don't know why a person cannot be a good preacher and a good teacher at the same time. Carl Duck, who was one of the congregation's more popular ministers, certainly fit that bill. And I would suggest that our current pastor would fit that bill. Would you agree? Don't mean to put him on the spot, but nonetheless. Those two are not mutual. They agreed, Phil. You can accommodate me later. 2 years ago, Central was ravaged by flood. Given our diminishing resources, human and material, question was, could we ever bring Central back to what it had been prior to the storm? Phil rallied the congregation, and it made remarkable progress, I think, cleaning out that building and getting it ready for repair. But the question nevertheless was gnawing. Do we really have the resources to bring it back? We're getting older. Our resources, material, are limited. Can we do it? It was at that juncture that the people of Friendship generously, graciously invited us to come over and worship with them. And that in due course led to where we are today. Central no longer exists. Friendship no longer exists. But together, as Grace Baptist Church, they are in a stronger position now than they would have been individually to continue the mission of spreading the good news.